everyone out there. It's nice to see a few faces and very happy to have you all here tuning in. We're going to start today, by the looks of it, with a photo of Darcy's house. Darcy, why are we starting with this?
Yeah, that's number 1 Bellevue Street, Maroubra. I'm actually in the corner window on the right-hand side right now, but the reason that we've decided to start with this photo is in that shed there, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, is 4 tons of Ugandan coffee. And right now it's just my house, but Brody, if you remember last year, it happened to be your house as well.
Right, it was my house, and it was also all of these guys' house. So this is the founding group of Kuas. It's not just Darcy and I that has started Kuas, but a group of 6 co-founders. And we sort of had, I guess, a Stanford prison experiment of our own in that house. Starting last year, we wanted to see what would happen to us and to our budding social enterprise if we were to all move into a big coffee house together, and just see what would happen if we let this social enterprise just take over every facet of our life.
Yeah, I think it really did take over every single facet of our lives. If you talk about lunch or dinner or brushing our teeth, or every time you walked out to the shed, all we would talk about was coffee, 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 coffee. But at the end of that 12 months, we survived. I think some of us moved out of the house so that we continued to survive, and that Kuas continued to survive as well. But if we go to the next slide, Kuas is a social enterprise, and in one sentence, it does world positive coffee for workplaces. Now, we launched Kuas in 1 Bellevue Street, Maroubra, in January of 2019. And in the 12 months that followed, we grew from 0 companies to 30 companies. So right now we're delivering to 30 coffee from Uganda to 30 companies all across the city. And all of our profits go back to Uganda, where that coffee comes from. Now, often we go into these companies and do a talk like this, and it's in person and it's a little bit nicer, but we typically ask 2 questions, and we'll see if we can replicate this online. So I've got some of your cameras on my screen, and I want to ask, who had a coffee this morning? And if you can just wave at me like that. Okay, yeah, seeing a lot of waves. So I'll move on to the second question. This one we're going to experiment with using the chat function. I want you to enter into the chat if you know where that coffee came from, where it originated from. No, yes, didn't drink coffee this morning. No, I do, I think. Uganda, someone drank coffee this morning.
Is that your brain?
Okay. So a lot of no's and a lot of I don't knows. And I think, Brody, that's probably the answer we were looking for, because if you think back maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we had no idea where our coffee came from. In fact, we didn't really know much about coffee at all. What did you study, Brody?
Well, I studied biomedical engineering at UNSW, and not a lot of coffee courses in that degree. How about you, Darcy?
I studied photovoltaic and solar energy engineering, so also not much to do with coffee. And it's probably no wonder that we cop this question all the time. How did you end up here? And if we rewind the clock back to 2017, Brody and I found ourselves on a pilot program, a UNSW engineering pilot program in northern rural Uganda. And the idea was that they would partner us as problem solvers with local agricultural students, and together we'd work with local farmers to try and develop solutions that would bring them into the cash economy.
Now, Darcy, I just wanted to ask a question here. What problem are you solving here on the farm? I'm not sure too much about that technique, and those pants don't look too dirty.
Well, Brody, I tried my best to find a photo of you actually getting your hands dirty at all, but without any success. But I think the point is that, yes, we weren't much help at all in that regard. And that was until we met this local student called Daniel. Now, this is one of my favorite photos, Brody, you on the left and Daniel on the right. And he's a local agricultural student who grew up in the near Mount Elgon, where a lot of Uganda's coffee is grown. And I remember swapping stories with Daniel and sharing the story of drinking coffee here in Sydney, the barista latte art culture, compared to his stories of growing coffee and the livelihoods that revolve around coffee as a crop in Uganda. And we realized that these stories are completely disconnected. But not only that, we also realized that coffee, because it's such a big part of the economy in Uganda and such a big part of livelihoods of families over there, it was a product that potentially could be a huge lever for us to drive more impact than I was driving with that hoe or that spade or whatever that tool was I was trying to use. So Brody, we're 2017, we're in Uganda, and I remember you convincing not only me, but probably 3 other students to bring back about 1 kilo of coffee each, smuggle it back in our backpacks to Sydney and see if there was something that we can do with it. And I was incredibly unconvinced that this idea was going to work. That is until we had it tasted by a number of top roasters here in Sydney, and they confirmed that this coffee was not just good, but actually a specialty crop. So
the question at that point was then, what do we do with the coffee, and how can we actually use it to create an impact back in the community that we were, I guess, touched by in that first trip. So 12 months later, we went back to Uganda, this time to the region that they grow coffee. We had a long list of questions that would, I guess, help us figure out what we're going to do and bring what Kuas is actually going to be. Things like who can we purchase coffee from responsibly? How are we going to get it to Australia? What does reinvesting potential profits back into this community look like? And what are the effective ways to do it? What's been tried and what works and doesn't? And even how do we make these decisions? Like what's the framework for these decisions? How do we measure it? And so after this trip, 4 weeks on the ground, we had our list of questions, and I think by the end of it, Darcy, we had the list would have probably tripled.
Yeah, I think we that second trip to Uganda, we definitely generated more questions than we had before we left, and I think that was when we realized what a hard space it was that we're working in. I remember coming back from that second trip, and we were in our final years of engineering at that point, and I was scrolling through the UNSW course book looking for an extra elective to slot in. And deep in that course book, I found this course called Comm 1000, Creating Social Change from Innovation to Impact. And I remember just sending you the first line of the course description, which is, do you want to change the world, but don't know where to start? And it's pretty lofty statement, but I'd say that was about where we were at. But Brody, weren't you a 6th-year engineer at this point as well?
Look, I might have been a 6-year engineer. It might have been a first-year course, but I think you were also a 5th-year engineer. And, at heart, we were very much first years. I remember sitting in the front row pretty much every tutorial and just frothing over what we were learning. It was so different to the engineering courses that I'd taken before. Here we were sort of starting to have conversations about real world problems and starting to be able to see what, I guess, the right approach is to solve or answer these questions that we had still about Kuas. And so one of the first things it taught us was that we hadn't zoomed out far enough with Kuas to be able to know what the problem is that we're actually trying to solve. We sort of had this answer, I guess, being coffee, but we didn't have the question, which, funnily enough, is literally the first step in the social change process, which is what you learn at the Centre for Social Impact, systems thinking. So identifying what the problem is, what the root causes are, looking at what's been done already, and then designing the solution from there. And I guess the other thing that it helped us understand was that this coffee wasn't telling the full story, right?
Yeah, well, I would love to say it was a 10-week course, and I would love to say that in that period of 10 weeks, we managed to solve all of those questions at once. But if you remember, we weren't actually allowed to share a group together. So we had to replicate the learnings outside of the classroom, which was great, because what that taught us was that this cup of coffee here wasn't telling the story that we needed it to. And the reason is that it doesn't matter where this coffee comes from. It could come from the most beautiful region in maybe the world, like our coffee does, if I give ourselves a little marketing plug, Brody. But at the end of the day, when it's served back in Sydney, it looks exactly the same as every other one of the 6 billion cups of coffee that us Australians drink every single year. And like us, and like a lot of people listening in, when you don't know where that coffee comes from, so you don't know the answer to this big question, you can accidentally be contributing to a pretty big problem just by drinking it. And in Uganda, that problem is essentially keeping poor coffee farmers poor, because typically less than 10% of the economic value extracted from a cup of coffee stays in the country of origin.
Yeah, and I think this question's relatively intuitive to think about, starting to think about where your coffee comes from, the people behind the bean, whether or not there's fairness and economic fairness and social fairness in that system. But the other side of the coin is where the coffee ends up afterwards. And we have obviously single-use bags and cups rampant in the coffee industry, but the sort of hidden story in all this is the coffee grounds themselves. So I think it's 100,000 tons of used coffee grounds every year in Australia are thrown away to landfill, which is really sad, because when you do that, firstly, it emits CO2 and methane just rotting away in landfill, which contributes to the climate change problem. But also, coffee grounds have so many different second uses, not only in natural systems, but also as other cool products. So these two questions, where our coffee comes from and where coffee ends up afterwards, have really driven our journey of Kua up until this point.
And if we're to, I guess, answer those two questions, so where does our coffee come from? It comes from here, Mount Elgon, Uganda. We visit there annually and buy direct from farmers paying at or above UTZ certified prices. And the second question, Brody?
Second question, where does our coffee end up? Well, we deliver in these big, loud blue buckets that say, we don't use single-use bags. And a part of that is getting people to think differently. So when we deliver to workplaces, we have 30 companies on board. We come in with this big blue bucket and we take away their used grounds in the same blue bucket. And so far we've done 3 tons of coffee diverted from landfill and to Sydney community gardens.
I think we all agree in our team that we honestly think that every single coffee company should be able to answer these two questions, and every single coffee consumer should be asking these two questions before drinking that cup. And then the world would be simply that would make the world a better place. But I think that Comm 1000 taught us that there is still no such thing as a simple solution. And it also taught us that businesses are stakeholders in the world and in the supply chains that they operate within. And I think, Brody, I beat you in paper, scissors, rock back in November last year, and so got to go to our 3rd trip to Uganda. And I think that was where it really hit home that simply just by answering those two questions, Kua wasn't solving the wicked problem or the real core issue that our coffee farmers are up against, and that is climate change. And we went there in harvest season, so it's normally dry, but it was torrential rain for nearly 3 weeks straight. We got trapped up on the mountain because landslides had blocked the road. And what's happening is that as prices are kind of plummeting around the world, coffee farmers are having to encroach higher and higher up the mountain to increase their yields to maintain their livelihoods, which means that when climate change is causing these cycles of rain and drought that didn't used to happen, entire slopes are slipping away. And what that's meaning is that A, these people aren't going to have a source of income in 5 and 10 years, and B, this is why every company should care about it. We're not going to have a source of coffee, or our business isn't going to be sustainable unless we take responsibility for the issues that are happening on the ground. So this is where we started to apply, I guess, systems thinking and started to try and tackle some of the root causes that are going on in our supply chain. And that was the reason for this third trip back to Uganda, where we made a partnership with a group called EcoTrust. And what that means is that this year, so 2020, every single cup of Kua coffee will enable a smallholder farmer to regenerate 4 square meters of Mount Elgon land by planting native trees and building terraced waterways, so that when climate change does have a bigger impact, the mountain is more resilient to those changes in weather, and the farms are more likely to be able to continue to thrive into the future.
And yeah, it's not perfect because there's no such thing as a perfect solution. But considering we're still selling coffee from Darcy's garage, we think we're doing more good than harm. And that segues to the next thing that we want to talk about, this idea of world positivity. But to get to the point, I guess, where we're at of being able to answer those 2 questions, sort of, to the best that we can at the point where we're at. To know exactly when you buy a kilo of coffee, where exactly every cent goes in the value chain, and to be able to know where every gram of coffee sold ends up in its, I guess, after first use life. To get to that point, we've had to forego or disregard a lot of sensible business advice, which I guess in itself made us sort of step back from coffee alone and start thinking, what is sensible business at that point? And as we said, 10 weeks wasn't enough to get through, to be able to complete this process. And it's the beautiful thing about it is that it's always evolving. But one thing I wanted to come back to, which is the 4th point, the top left corner, is measuring impact. And we've discovered that now we've sort of got the first 3 quadrants finished. This is a really, really important part of our next step. And I guess the complexity of what we've discovered there is, I guess, quite profound. But we're starting to want to understand better for ourselves, and I guess for the world, what is world positive business? We really like this term because we think it's really inherently focused around measurement and is somewhat intuitive to imagine a net positive impact on people and the planet. And one way that we think about it is a company that has a bigger handprint than its footprint. So a bigger handprint than its footprint.
Yeah, I would say that when we came across this, I think it originated with a group in Harvard University a few years ago, and we loved it so much, or we thought it communicated to our consumers so clearly what we were trying to do that we put it straight in our tagline. And the best thing about making a decision like that is that all of a sudden you're accountable to that statement. So then we built up pillars around how we're trying to be a world positive business. And we've developed these 3 pillars of improved well-being for all who touch Kua coffee, complete circularity for all material inputs and resources, and climate justice for all vulnerable stakeholders and future generations. And these are very utopian and idealistic, but I think that's also the best thing because it means that we can continuously strive towards those pillars and every year improve on how we're operating and communicate that in a really transparent manner to our stakeholders. So we only came up or implemented this in the last few months. So we're still learning how to understand and measure how we're doing these initiatives. But I think a lot of the stuff that we've talked about does link cleanly within one of these 3 initiatives. And more than that, I think in the same way that we wish that every single coffee company was able to answer those 2 questions of where does your coffee come from and where does your coffee end up, our team of perhaps naive but hopeful young people hope that all businesses are able to, I guess, strive to be a world positive business. And then we wonder, you know, what is the role of business in making a big impact on our world and on problems like climate change?
Yeah, and towards happy days is what we're all about, and I think that's probably going to be wrapping up our preso at this point. Is that right, Darcy?
Yeah, question time. Fire away.
Days.
Oh, happy days. Gotta say, I'm a morning coffee drinker, but I feel like one now. Thanks so much, guys. That was really interesting. I learned a lot personally, and I'm sure our webinar attendees did too. I can see one of our attendees making a cup of coffee right now, Sandeep.
I think that's the second coffee we've made in this presentation.
So I have a number of questions, and we've also received some from our attendees, which is fantastic. So the first question is a fairly simple one, hopefully, but what's the meaning of the name Kua?
Kua means to grow in Swahili, which is an East African language that is spoken commonly between, not super prevalent in Uganda, but it's the connecting language of East Uganda. So, grow.
Tell us about your team here in Australia. I assume they're in Australia. How many of them are there, and where are they located?
Well, right now, I think they're located between, Brody, are you in Albury?
Yeah, temporarily, but I'm in Albury.
So we've taken full advantage of the current situation to spread out geographically. So we've got Albury, Tasmania, Cooma, and Sydney on the cards, but normally we're all in Sydney. It's a team of a team of 5 this year. We're all ex-UNSW students and kind of friends of friends of friends, and we brought people on based on areas of expertise that Brody and I didn't have personally.
Okay.
So we have, Bree, who looks after impact, Hamish, who looks after operations and logistics, Digby, who looks after brand and photography, and Brody and I, that I guess between us look after strategy and finance and marketing.
Okay, great. All the questions are rolling in. I love it. Might get to mine first. So I would like to go back to when you were uni students. One, how did you get to Uganda? Like, how did you actually get there, and why were you there? And then, well, actually, I'll get you to answer that one first.
Yeah, sure. So part of the 2025 strategy, which I guess came out around 2015, was giving more international experiences to current students. And Darcy and I are just right place, right time as engineering students, because they were running a pilot program between UNSW and a university in northern Uganda to bring engineering students out to work on farms. And yeah, it was very much a blank canvas. There was no, I would say there was no real clear reason why we were there, except for just to scope out what is possible with a partnership there. So yeah, we were just right place at the right time. Two of 10 engineering students that got to go.
Okay. And what made, you were 20 somethings, maybe you're still 20 somethings. What made you think that you could start a social enterprise? Like, that's pretty full on to do, like, just, say, I'm going to just start a social enterprise. Like, how did that happen?
I don't think it was an intentional decision. I would say that we came back from Uganda with coffee. We wanted to do something with it. And I guess right place, right time, one of the first people that we talked to was a man called Shahe at UNSW Founders Centre. And I guess with coffee, wanting to sell it and to make a profit, he pointed us towards this, business model idea. Whereas previously we'd thought about setting it up as a student project or a charity initiative purely. But social enterprise seemed a really good way to make a sustainable and ongoing impact after we did a little bit more research on what all of our options were.
Mm-hmm. And Jessica asks, how long did it take you from idea to launch? And is there anything you would do differently?
Well, I guess the idea, you'd say, started in 2017, and then it took a whole year to figure out what the questions were that we needed to answer. And then another year after that to get to actually selling coffee. and starting to actually run like a business. So maybe a year and a half to 2 years to actually start, and then it's been 3 years total. Anything we would do differently? I don't know, Darcy, what do you think?
I think I would have just moved a little bit faster. We used to spend so long on diagrams and branding, and we have this ongoing joke, Brody, about that prospectus document. So for example, rather than just jumping in and testing whether companies want to buy our coffee and whether the business model works, we spent ages preparing a document to try and secure funding. So I think moving to proof of concept as quickly as possible would be my biggest thing to do differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we ran this, like this first small trial we did was giving away free coffee for a fortnight to a few companies that we just called on the phone. And to do that was really easy, but it probably took us 14 months to get to that point, even though we had the coffee there the whole time. So yeah, I think just trying things out on a little bite-sized ways before investing a lot of time doing things that without uncertain outcomes is a good point.
Mm-hmm. And so just a basic question, you supply coffee to businesses in Sydney, is that right? Okay.
Yep.
And so the coffee, whereabouts in Uganda is it from? Or is that a secret?
we hope that's the least secret that we have. We hope everyone knows. So most of the photos are from a region called Mount Elgon. This year, our coffee actually arrived this week from here, which is pretty exciting. But there's a particular ridge called Bukanakwa Ridge, and we spent 3 days up there watching about 4 tons of cherries being handpicked. And then we'll buy that lot, and it will get shipped over all in one bunch to Sydney. We then also buffer that with 2 other regions, one in the same Mount Elgon in the east, and one in the west on the other side of the country. And that's both for taste and to kind of mitigate against any supply chain risks, so that we're not caught dry if something happens with our, one main area.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk a bit about, like you did mention your local partner organisations in Uganda. So how do the people there locally benefit from what you do?
Darcy, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, sure thing. So they benefit both at the start, so when we buy coffee, and at the end when we reinvest our profits. So while we're a social enterprise, which requires 50% reinvestment, we're also a registered charity, which means that 100% of our profits go back to Uganda. So when we buy direct, which means that there's no middlemen, so that farmers get the market price of the coffee in their hand immediately, which incentivizes them to essentially keep the cherries on the tree until they're ready. So middlemen will often come and kind of bulk purchase the whole farm's worth of cherries, which means that they get a lower price. We buy them when they're red, when they're picked, at the highest possible market price. And they get that money instantly. And then when it arrives in Australia, they also get something called a hungry season bonus. You can imagine a family without much income getting all of their income in one big lump. It can be quite difficult to schedule that payment out throughout the year. So around about now, they're getting another payment on top of what we've already paid. So that's with an organization called Zakukabora. The impact organization we work with at the other end of the value chain is called EcoTrust. And we give all of our profits to them to engage the same farmers with regeneration activities. So not only do they get benefits through their land being built for climate resilience, they also get a diversified source of income as they're paid to plant native trees and to build those waterways that I talked about.
And Chris has just asked a question on top of that, which I think I know the answer, but how much more do the growers get paid by you in comparison with general commercial firms?
Yeah, we had a look at that for our particular region. We're about 17% above UTZ certified prices. UTZ certified prices are already very good for that region, and farmers can drop to can be paid like half or even below half of what UTZ kind of stipulates as the minimum amount that they should be being paid.
Cool. And Celine and Sandeep are both curious to know, how did you go about formulating your model and also finding all of those partners?
The model very much evolved as we figured out what we were going to do. So Darcy mentioned Shahe, who was a business or a UNSW entrepreneur coach, and Darcy and I hadn't had much experience with business models and knowing where to start with that type of thing. But I believe it was sort of his like initial idea to say, maybe there's an opportunity to go business to business rather than doing consumer end coffee, which is really saturated in Sydney, especially, and very difficult to stand out. But here's this little gap in the B2B market where companies are becoming more and more interested in their social impact and their environmental footprint and their social responsibility. Maybe that's where you can tap in. And so we thought that was a brilliant idea. And it really just started with making those phone calls, trying to get our foot in the door by giving away free coffee. And then it sort of led into an ongoing sales strategy that changed probably on a quarterly basis, if not more frequently, where we tried pretty much everything and are still trying a lot of different techniques to bring companies on board. So that goes from the cold calling, cold emails that you might, like was probably our first go-to, then to switching to offering events and going to events and speaking at events and trying to build more brand awareness that way. And also trying to, we've tried different methods with our marketing to bring more companies to us and do social media advertising and that, but haven't really fully dived into that yet. But I think what's been really effective is wherever there are events with business leaders all in the same room, is to just show up and talk about what we're doing. And it's very, I guess, a much softer sell in that way. It's sort of just like people with the same interests talking about something. Hey, what you guys are doing is really cool. Maybe I'll try and get into my company. And that method's probably been our most effective, I'd say.
The individual champions.
Yeah, totally.
And this webinar recording will help as well, hopefully. Mike asks, how big did you find the shipping and entry of beans to Australia and getting those farmers' beans to your garage?
I think it would be a nightmare if we started out completely on our own, but what we do is there are 2 other cafes that buy from the same farmers group as us. So we split a shipping container with them and then just pay, we'll fill up a third of it, so we'll pay a third of it. And they've actually had that supply chain already in place. So it was an easy way for us to get started.
That's very handy. And how did you find them? Like, how, I suppose through the growers, is that how it
Mount Elgon is literally a coffee city. So on that second trip, we parked up there for maybe 2 weeks and walked to every single coffee kind of depot that there was and asked questions, and then asked questions of farmers about their experiences with all of the different organizations that they could potentially sell to. And then we kind of mixed that with advice from international importers, so that we, I guess, talked to as many stakeholders as possible about who was doing the right thing, and then asked if they wanted to form a partnership around us buying their coffee as well.
Mm-hmm. Another question, curious to hear how you balance working on the vision of Kuas with the reality of paying the bills, your rent, all that stuff that we have to pay.
I think this came to head for some of us last year, where I mentioned we were trying this experiment of moving into a house and letting it take over our life. From my experience anyway, I got to the point of needing to stop that for a moment and figure out how I'm actually going to get money to do those things. So it's been a juggle, I would say. And we're luckily at the point from start of 2020, we actually have paid staff now. But for the first sort of 2 years, it was, I guess, probably one of the I guess, tougher parts of what we're doing is we had like the passion to want to spend all of our time on this, but the reality of needing to actually be realistic with time and money and other life things, you just have to, well, we just found that we had to be lenient and to ourselves and give ourselves that time and space when we needed it.
But also, I think, Brody, we have an ongoing tension between spending internal resources on sales and marketing versus spending internal resources on measuring and reporting impact. And I don't think we've got an answer for that yet. I think we're, at the moment, prioritizing reaching self-sufficiency as a business while doing everything that we can in setting up our supply chain so it's as sustainable and as ethical as possible. And then once we're self-sufficient, we'll probably aim to use a lot of grant funding to try and improve our world positivity and add on additional initiatives, I guess, to show what is possible in this space.
Mm-hmm. Chris had a question around that. Do you have a reporting format which shows you each month how you're performing against your world positive objective? I suppose that answers that question, that it's coming.
I actually tuned into the finance webinar a couple of days ago, and since then our chart of accounts has a separate reporting financially based on what's core business and what's impact only. But this is a massive area of improvement for us in terms of putting numbers behind our impact. And hopefully, we'll get a lot better at it in the next 6 months.
That's great to hear. I'm really interested, and a few people have asked this as well, around, during your journey, who gave you advice and who helped you along the way?
Shahay's probably number one, Darcy, I would say.
There's a lot of people, Brody. We better mention the Vice Chancellor and Chancellor.
Yeah. Your mum's been quite influential, Darcy.
I hope my mum's not in this webinar. I told her that I'd get too shy. But yeah, we had Shahay as a coach from UNSW founders, but I think Professor Ian Jacobs and also David Gonski actually gave us some mentoring right at the start and some financial gift, which enabled us to purchase our first 2 tons of coffee and essentially kickstart it. So that was a huge catalyst.
That's pretty helpful. What about from a mentoring perspective? Do you have mentors? Who do you go to when you need a bit of advice?
I guess my biggest mentor, not necessarily advising on Kua business strategy, but more along the lines of this sort of work-life balance and figuring out, I guess, more of a personal thing, is actually our tutor for Comm 1000, Ali, who ended up becoming my thesis advisor as well. So business mentors, Darcy's in a few groups, sort of business groups that I know they've offered him and us by tangent a lot of advice.
I suppose along the way, as you need advice, depending on what it is, you need to check in, you go to different people at different parts of the journey.
Yeah, I'd say everyone in the team has their own mentors, and we'll probably look at formalizing an advisory board as well towards the end of the year. Something that's been on the to-do list for a long time, but has been informal up to this point.
So speaking of your to-do list, I imagine it's quite long. So I'm just keen to know what a day in your life, once you've had your surf. I know that you like surfing. Being a Maroubra boy. Sorry, I'm not sure you're not near the surf, Brody, at the moment, but what's a typical day for you like, or is there a typical day?
We have a 9:45 a.m. stand-up as a team where we tell everyone what we're up to. And I would say that things are so, I guess, typically fast-paced as a startup that it has varied quarter to quarter. So for me at the moment, I'm, particularly as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, I'm Mr. Finance and spending a lot of time in Xero and spreadsheets, trying to model what our financial situation is and how long we have until we reach that point of self-sufficiency. but it can also vary from running internal meetings to meeting with partners and stakeholders, and once a year getting to traipse around the coffee mountains in Uganda.
That's pretty cool. What about you, Brody?
Well, mine's a little different. So I am only working on Kua very much part-time nowadays, as of the start of 2020. I'm now working for the Lowy Institute as my full-time job. So last year at Kua, I would say no 2 days were the same, so I couldn't really give a clear answer for what the schedule looked like. But nowadays, it mostly looks like getting up, brewing a Kua coffee, going to virtual work, and staying on the communications and working my 1 day a week at Kua on a Friday.
Nice. Lots of people want to get into the nitty gritty of Kua. More questions. 2 big questions. What is the next? Well, that's actually one. What's the next big challenge? Where do you want to take it from this point?
Cool. What's the next big challenge? So when COVID happened, we had this vision of growing Kua to the point in Sydney that it was self-sufficient, and then replicating that business model with other young people in cities all over the world, and we're super excited about it. And then COVID happened, and initially we thought, we've got workplaces on subscription, this isn't going to affect us too much, continue as normal. And 2 weeks later, 28 out of our 30 workplaces started working from home, and suddenly we had a very big problem on our hands, which was great because it forced us to really think about what we were doing and why. And so I had a chat with every single person on the team to try and understand what their psychological and financial runways were, and how much we could push this initial growth stage of Kua. And what we realized was that perhaps this whole social franchising model that we dreamed about wasn't the most realistic path for us to take, but instead what we should be focusing on is building this hub in Sydney that is the most world positive and sustainable coffee company that we can possibly build. So we've got this new vision that by the middle of next year, Kua is completely contained and built to the point that it will continue having impact in the way that we've designed it forever, regardless of whether Brody or myself or any of our core team are still involved day to day. And we think that we've coined that stewardship, so that Kua's success is not really tied to the team that have, I guess, been underpaid for so long, but instead anyone can come and work for an amazing company, be paid properly, and this social enterprise will continue doing its thing in Sydney and potentially serve, I guess, as an inspiration for other people to follow suit in other places.
Wow. Anything to add to that, Brody? That's pretty thorough. Another question here from Celine. Would you say there's a large trade-off between profitability and having an ethical supply chain that may incur higher costs? That's a good one. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think in the short term, yes. Like in the immediate short term, when we very first started, we would have saved a lot of money, and yeah, like I guess human resources if we completely ignored all of that side of things. But my view is that over the long term, that eventually comes back to bite you in whatever, in I guess in a marketability way, in a transparency way. There's very few companies that can, I guess, survive a long time by not doing due diligence with their supply chain and everything that goes along with that. So short term, it's costly, but it's totally an essential part of creating a sustainable social enterprise and a world positive business if we want to go that far.
Following on from that, Chris has asked, how do you differentiate your offering from the more general fair trade supply lines? And what limits do you see on your ultimate growth and therefore your social impact? Ooh.
So in terms of differentiation, and there's a couple of questions around certification as well. And we got some amazing advice pretty early on in the days from another ethical coffee roaster who was based in Melbourne. And he said, everyone does great coffee, and within a year, everyone will be sourcing their coffee ethically. So what are you going to do differently? And I think in terms of certification, we don't do that much differently. We do it very well in buying direct, or as a backup, we buy it as UTZ certified, but I wouldn't say that that's our unique selling point. I also would say that at the moment, we're one of, one or two companies that are completely closed loop, which is probably our biggest selling point right now. But as we said in the presentation, there's no reason that other coffee companies can't and shouldn't copy that element of our business too. So I think it's the team is genuinely there to use Kua as a way to solve a social and an environmental problem rather than just to grow or to make money. And that's where, we continue to invest resources and money internally on finding the right partnerships to reinvest our profits fairly. And I think that that's what differentiates ourselves, that we're actually using this business to fix, or to try, there's no such thing as fixing, as Comm 1000 will tell you, but to try and address a wicked problem that is often, I guess, propagated by normal coffee businesses.
Okay, we had a question around certification from Matt, and you just mentioned UTZ certification. So he's asked, do you use any certification like UTZ? And can you please explain to us what that means?
Yeah.
That's my question.
Brody, or do you want me to? So I'll touch on three. There's fair trade, UTZ or UTZ certified, and direct trade, which is uncertified. Fair trade, I guess, started the whole certification initiative and did an amazing job of holding buyers accountable for the well-being of their coffee farmers. It was largely based around people's well-being and has a minimum price associated. UTZ is about to intersect with Rainforest Alliance. They also have a focus on people's livelihoods and well-being, but their big focus is on sustainability. So there's rules around how you maintain the upkeep of your farm, training farmers for climate change, and using pesticides close to natural sources of water. In Uganda, there are limited fair trade options. There is a whole bunch of UTZ certified options, but then there are also small groups that are locally run that just do the right thing. They're run by the community and they buy coffee from farmers directly. And that's who we've opted to go for. There's a couple of reasons. One is that the coffee is better quality because you're working with really, really small farms on a really personal scale. And the other is that there's almost complete transparency around where your money is going. We worked and saw the cash change hands when we buy, our 4-ton shipment for the year. So we do that, I guess, for the sake of supporting small organizations on the ground and also having the relationships with farmers directly. That's for about 70% of our import. The other 30% we use UTZ certified coffee, and that's bought through a much, much bigger organization, and that's to buffer against supply risks.
Okay, got it. Another question, I think. Brianna's asked, what is closed loop? And how does it apply to Kua?
Yep. So closed loop would mean that we're talking about the flow of materials here. So generally a linear, I guess, product life, which is about 90% of products in the world, take, make, and then dispose that product when we're finished using it. But a closed loop system means that the material resource continues to be, so I guess, cycle through the economy again and again and again. So an example with the coffee is that it's roasted, or it's grown, it's roasted, it's then sold, drunk. The second, I guess, life that coffee can have is in other products. So if that coffee was to then go into a body scrub or a soap or into fiber or as a compost or a soil solution, that is keeping that material in the economy and keeping it out of landfill as a just discarded material.
Okay, that makes sense. I just want to change tack slightly. So you were students of Comm 1000 as engineering students, so you randomly came across it, although you were doing a bit of searching. And so it sounds like that pretty much opened up your eyes, because you were on a path to be engineers, is that correct? Like you were quite sort of set in what you wanted to do. So what was it like when you first got into that unit and, you know, started doing your first lectures and tutorials?
I couldn't believe we were in a course where students talk to each other. I mean, after 5 years of engineering, it was amazingly participatory, and it was, while it was technical in some respects, it wasn't numbers driven. And I think that made me realize that I really care about, I guess, yes, there are technical solutions to social problems, but focusing just on the technical side alone wasn't super interesting to me. So I actually pivoted with my thesis and applied some of the systems thinking that I learned from Comm 1000 to renewable energy challenges. And so I think there is an intersection between engineering and what you learn in Comm 1000, but it really teaches you to think with a holistic and a social perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd echo that too. I think it helped me just connect. I was a bit unsure of how engineering could be used to solve like these actual social issues, but it made me realize that the type of thinking that we're taught in engineering is really, really diverse and applicable to a lot of different areas, including social impact.
Mm-hmm. And so now, well, you have tutored in that unit, Brody, and you're currently tutoring Darcy. So I love, when I heard about your story, just to let everyone know, I find it really interesting that you were students and now you've become teachers. So what's that like for you? You've looked around and now you're teaching others. What's it like?
I also tutored engineering courses, but I hope there's not too many people from the engineering school here, but I really love the dynamic in Comm 1000. And I also love that I feel, yes, I'm facilitating a lot of the content and joining discussions, but I'm learning so much. And the reason is that every term students are choosing new social issues to write about and to talk about. And often those are completely something that I've never been aware of before. I also use it as an opportunity to get feedback on coffee. If we're talking about a grant application, it's amazing how much of the syllabus we have to run through. And I'll show the students and see what they think on how we're using the, I guess, concepts in real life.
Wow, that's amazing for the students. It's a real life practical example. And Brody, Sandeep rightly pointed out that you guys won the amazing Big Idea competition. He shared a link in the chat feed for those who don't know about it. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? And then I'll get to my last question.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sandeep, for sharing that. That was 2018. Part of the business school also ran the Big Idea competition. It's sort of a course, but also an external competition with the Big Idea magazine. So we won the UNSW leg by pitching Kuas. Maybe had a bit of an upper hand that we'd been working on this idea for a year before the course even started, but we then got flown down to Melbourne to, I guess, pitch with where they were from, Darcy, Perth and Melbourne and Canberra, universities around Australia. And we ended up taking that out, which was a real honour to be, I guess, acknowledged as one of the, I guess, their favourite young social enterprise in Australia.
That's amazing. Well done. Well done for a few years ago, but it is an amazing effort. The last question I wanted to finish off with is, what as individuals, like what can I do, what can our attendees do to support Kuas and to help you have even more impact?
So follow us on Instagram to start with. That's so easy.
I'll share that now.
But when this crazy world goes back to normal, we generate impact by selling coffee, and we sell coffee in workplaces. And at least half of the workplaces that we've got on as partners right now have come through friends of ours or colleagues of ours who've just heard about and liked our story. So whether you're an intern or a sustainability manager or a facilities manager, there's no reason why you can't be that, as you said, Rhonda, internal champion to get Kua coffee into your office. And then your office will be having an impact with every cup of coffee that it drinks. And we will also be a little bit further on our way to, you know, financial sustainability, which will mean that we'll be here for a lot longer.
I need to get CSI onto that, our coffee supply. Brody, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Darcy wrapped it up beautifully there. The entrepreneur idea of anyone in a workplace can be a change maker really rings true. We've seen grads be able to get the higher ups in their workplace to make that decision, grad students. So really is anyone can do it as long as you really want to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yep. Everyone can have that impact in their own way. Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank you both. I've really enjoyed your presentation to start with and then interviewing you. You're really great to interview. And thank you to everyone who asked questions and participated. Most of the questions I asked were from attendees. I missed a few of mine, but that's fine. I'll ask you another time. But again, thanks. We are recording this and I will share it soon. And we are running Impact 2020 until the end of the week. Friday is our last webinar. We have some really cool webinars coming up. I encourage you to check them out at impact2020.online. And thank you very much. I hope you all have a lovely afternoon. Thanks, Darcy and Brody. Bye. See ya.